Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another Water Power of Canada webinar. Before we begin today, I would like to acknowledge that Ottawa is located on the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. We extend our respect to all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples for their valuable past and present contributions to this land. We have a special guest today, Chris Henderson. Chris Henderson is the head of Indigenous Clean Energy, and we're going to be speaking about the involvement of Indigenous communities and our hydropower industry in Canada. As I'm sure everyone is aware, this relationship is getting stronger and stronger every year. And we are looking forward to exploring some of the themes and complexities around this relationship. So, Chris, thank you very much for joining us. For everyone's information, he is a Canadian eco-entrepreneur and environmental innovator. Chris is amongst the country's foremost energy transition commentators. He's held a spectrum of prominent leadership positions at the intersection of clean energy, clean tech, climate change, and sustainable prosperity for over 4 decades. He offers transformative analysis to accelerate Canada and the world's transition to a clean energy future. He's particularly known as a strategist and for his outstanding skills in designing and implementing transformative energy policies, financing innovation, and kickstarting large-scale, high-impact projects essential for low-emissions electrification economy. So thank you very much, Chris, for joining us today. I know you have some data you'd like to share with us, and then we'll dive into a conversation. For those of us who are listening, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you should see a button that says More. By clicking on that, you can see show captions if you'd like to hear the comments or like to read it in French as well as we go along. And you'll also see a Q&A button that you can use to ask questions of Chris. So thank you very much again. Over to you.
Thanks, Lorena. Thanks for inviting me. Great to join you all here. So, in my role as founding executive director of Indigenous Clean Energy, we're the national hub that has supported Indigenous capacity building to be partners in clean energy projects. I'm going to be pulling up a few infographics from our most recent national survey, which is called Regenerative Energy, which highlights the involvement of Indigenous communities in renewable energy transmission and storage projects, and obviously also water power projects. So let me just put up these, and we'll make these available as well for you after the presentation. We track, and we have for about 2, 3 decades, we've tracked the number of projects that are being developed. This is typically projects 1 megawatt to as high as 4,000 megawatts that are around the country. We also track smaller community projects, but typically the work we do is to tracking some of the larger projects. And you'll see, for example, here's the distribution, and you'll see the large percentage that was related to hydro, very much a result of the last 60, 100 years of development across the country. And I'm going to go through these relatively quickly, but you can look at them in more detail at a later point in time. And then we're also tracking the projects that are now in construction. And so what you see is a bit of a change there. We're seeing more work on the wind side, some of the hydro side, but these trends shift over time, and we'll expect to see a little bit more coming up on the hydro side over the next 4 or 5 years. And we also look at which projects are in the planning stage. And here's you see the difference. For example, I mean, if you look at the projects in construction, there's not many hydro projects in construction, but we are seeing more water power projects being planned currently relative to what's that are in construction. So this is how things change over time as we move along. And what this I'll leave this presentation here. Will give this chart really tells the sale. This is the last 20 years of Indigenous clean energy projects over the country. And you see there's a consistent growth of Indigenous participation, increasingly as equity owners. The current lay of the land, frankly, is around 40 to 50% or more of equity ownership of projects by First Nations, Métis, or Inuit organizations. We also track them by territory, so you'll see a lot of projects in BC and Ontario, again showing some of the early hydro projects in particular. But pretty well every province has projects. PI is one that doesn't, but we'll be having a couple very, very soon. We'd also note that when you look at the projects around the country, we see this kind of fit coming together where there's what provincial and territorial governments, utility and development partners are looking for, how this ties to regional and national economies, and how it intersects with Indigenous clean energy leadership. And so we actually see the pace of growth, that chart that I showed you showing the number of projects that have Indigenous partnership, that's the history of where we stand today. We actually see that growth accelerating quite significantly in the next 5 years. I mean, a metric that we've disclosed in the report, the national survey, by the way, is available on our website to download in detail with all the explanatory notes and calculations, including the amount of revenue being earned by communities, the amount of job creation, and things like that. But what we really see is the growth going even further and even faster. Currently, around 20% of Canada's electricity generating infrastructure is owned, co-owned, or as a defined financial benefit with Indigenous partners. By 2031, that will be almost 25%. So the growth function is really, really accelerating quite sharply. The final 2 points I'll make here about in the national survey is that you'll see how we see these four things coming together that make really good projects: strong community engagement, strong capacity of government, strong partnership, and strong policy and procurement frameworks. And so when jurisdictions do those effectively, and there's good partners working effectively, like members of Water Power Canada, the strong community engagement, which is very much in ICE's role, that's when the projects really have the impacts that they both have in terms of the pace of development, the amount of earnings, and the amount of actual benefits that are being created in terms of job creation that are actually optimal. And also, I won't go into detail here on this, but in the national survey, we have made a series of recommendations in terms of how to move this forward. And several of them name organizations like Water Power Canada and different development organizations, because what we see is really more of a curated or collaborative approach. So these recommendations are not saying the government should or someone should do this. The recommendations are very much about how we work together. So that's the initial presentation, Lorena. I'm happy to answer questions about that. But effectively, I would summarize this by saying is that Indigenous involvement in clean energy is large. It's growing. Water power is the largest historical segment, a bit lower down the last few years, but about to pick up again. And we really see that the collaborative approach between Indigenous communities, between development companies, between utilities, and between governments is the way we work together. And that's why we really like the idea of this kind of collaborative and curated approach. Let me stop there, Lorena, and I'll just
Thank you.
go back there.
Well, I'm looking at your slide. Actually, if we could go back to your slide,
Sure.
with the regenerative, that last one. I think it would be interesting if we walk through some of those concepts before we dive into the conversation.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the first three or four, like first one to four, we really pushed a need to create certain funding parameters. We are concerned with the federal government that there's a series of funding programs like CERC and SREP and others are either overextended or have been closed. So we've been advocating for much more work on that side. We do think northern remote communities are very important, and we've been pushing that along the way. But also looking at things like clean energy economic best practices, that's one thing I would highlight for your members, Lorena, is that I actually think that we need to have a coming together between development companies, utilities, governments, and Indigenous communities about how we get the maximum economic benefits from projects, getting to the supply chain, getting to skilled trades, getting to employment, getting to, where projects are generating even more benefits than simply the actual generated electrons. And so these recommendations are getting at those issues, including work being done in terms of the skills development on our side, the issue of how industry and Indigenous partnerships work together. So in the detail of the national survey, and we'll make sure after people get the link to the full survey, these are all explained in some detail, and we see this as being opening a conversation to have more discussion about how we move the clean energy sector forward, and obviously in this case, water power forward as well.
That's excellent. I'm just looking at this. So when you have, for example, fascinating the idea of having this best practices development strategy. I think that's very, very helpful for future development, and also it's a way for our different members to share information across borders because some provinces do things differently and than others, and that's a really helpful perspective. For the early stage Indigenous Clean Energy Projects Fund, how do you classify your early stage? What is this to
Yeah.
help during the planning? Is it to get the communities ready for projects that are planned in their area? How does that what how do you classify an early stage?
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail. There's three things. Is that one, it's to build community capacity so they can be effective partners and they're informed, which is really key. Secondly, it's for project assessment and feasibility. So it's writing down some of the project risks at the earlier stages. So and thirdly, it's partnership formation to make sure the right partnerships are formed. So we believe that that is a role that government should support and that support with Indigenous communities, but that also then interfaces with partners. And so we feel that that early stage support really is necessary because if you don't have the right project assessed, you don't have the right community engagement and capacity, and you don't have the right partnership formation, then things kind of get break down later in the process or may never even move forward. So that's the one that we think that a renewal of programs like CERC and other things like that with NRCan is very important because that has been very helpful in the last 5 to 10 years.
And so if we are looking, and I'm going to jump around a little bit from the questions I know we've discussed, but I think that's very timely. So if we're looking at the federal government's initiative to have projects approved in under a year, that's after they've applied for an environmental assessment, for example, or federal review. But that it seems to be very key to be able to have those agreements and those relationships in place well ahead of the time when a proponent is applying for permitting. So would you see that funding potentially coming in to actually encourage the partnerships to start forming well before the applications are submitted then? This is where I'm.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, earlier is always better. I'll be honest. I mean, the government's made certain commitments, as you've noted, in terms of accelerated approvals and the work of the Major Project Office. Frankly, a lot of projects happened without all that stuff. Just assuming that there was if you look at the range number of projects, which the report here tracks, a lot of things have happened right in the last 2 decades, especially in the last 10 years. And the reality is that if you get it right, exactly what you said, Lorena, if you get it right with the right partnerships, the right community engagement, so communities can make sure that they are on board and the conditions that make them comfortable with being on board, as some of the things in the Paths Forward report has highlighted, then things move forward relatively well. Whether it moves forward in a year or 18 months or 14 months, I don't think is the real issue. The real issue is the grounding of a really good project with a really good partnership with really good community involvement. Those are the real requirements for success. And so just having a government wave a magic wand to me is not really the key issue. The key issue is supporting the nature of partnership and supporting Indigenous communities to make sure they're active partners. And if you do that, the results show in the last 10 years, we've been all doing pretty good.
Yeah, actually, I would say that our for everyone's information, our Path Forward report is coming out this week, and it will highlight some of those partnerships with our members that have been very successful. And I think it really shows the sensitivity that our members have towards obviously the communities that are impacted by their developments, and we all understand that it actually has to be a true partnership. That's really the expectation. And I think a lot of them are stepping up. So um, I think from an industry perspective, that it's interesting that you make that comment because sometimes it feels as though the government is looking for us to do more and more when a lot of those things are actually already happening and were happening before in some cases too, or quite organically. So it's interesting to hear you
Yeah.
make that comment, Chris.
Yeah, and I also note, let's remember we've got very strong parameters in place. I mean, we're big fans of the CIB and the work there. I think it's been very effective. We're seeing provinces. I mean, BC released its Indigenous Loan Guarantee Fund last week. Manitoba will be doing that shortly with its wind project fund and things like that. I mean, certain jurisdictions have been very strong, and frankly, I mean, if you don't have a good partnership, if you don't have a real community engagement, chances are you probably won't get a project that'll move ahead. So, but at the end of the day, federal support has been material in the last 10 years. And pretty well all those funds, with the exception of SREP, they all sunset at the end of this fiscal year. And we are very concerned about that. And we've been very active in expressing that to the government, to ministers. I think we'll see some responses, but I actually I'll be honest, I found with the National Electricity Strategy a little bit of naivete in what's there. I mean, the intention and direction was good about the National Electricity Strategy and fair measure. But some of the measures they put in there were ones that were historical or already happened. Though we really do like with the ITC and the issues there that we like some clarifications about how the ITC will be implemented in certain kinds of projects. So really it's let's remember the federal government doesn't do projects. Um,
No,
uh,
that's a good point. Yeah.
Utilities, partners, and indigenous communities do projects
Mhm.
with support with the approval of provinces and territories. And so I think the federal government has a role, but I always lead with provinces and territories. I think that's where the action really is. And we are over I mean, we find we're working more and more with provinces and territories, giving them input as to how they can move forward with good projects that are with private sector developers, sometimes with Crown or state util or private utilities, and certainly with Indigenous partners. So the trend line's solid.
And so the title of this particular slide is regenerative energy recommendations. So what's your vision behind the term regenerative?
That's a really good question. We talk about it at the start of the report and the narrative report. We think regenerative energy, first of all, has to really recognize the fact that there is indigenous territorial rights, there's treaty rights that are at play. There is the presence of UNDRIP, there is the presence of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but also that ecologically, it's so important to do projects right. I mean, I always recollect, a hydro project which I advised the committee on the French River, which was Canada's first heritage river, but we did do a project there beside one of the dams that were built 120 years with the Dokis Nation, and at that time a company called Hydromega. And when we did the project, we made sure we restored the riparian zones. We made sure that we rebuilt the spawning beds for walleye and for river sturgeon. We made sure we protected the medicine zones on that side. And I think the regenerative energy really is saying, let's look at the holistic nature of projects. So it's stronger partnerships that's recognizing Indigenous rights, but it's also getting more spin-off and more recognition that we can be better ecologically about how we do projects. So that, I mean, I think a lot of what my experience has been, having been involved with about 40 major projects where I've advised Indigenous communities, apart from my work with ICE, is that I find that if you move with the right kind of partnership and you design projects well, you can make decisions that can actually some very real recognition of protecting certain species, protecting certain habitat. But in fact, I mean, you can go further. You can be restorative. And so regenerative energy is trying to say, let's look at the larger picture so that we get the full set of benefits economically in terms of the performance of generation of power or transmission and storage, but also going further to make sure that we actually have greater protection of the environment and that involvement of the community. So we describe this in some detail at the front end of the report. So I'd encourage anyone here to get a copy of it, and we'll make sure you have the links.
Excellent, Chris. Thank you. That's very inspiring. And I've often said that the hydro industry is one of the only ones that actually has its own ecosystem. Lots of communities actually use those reservoirs for fishing, for recreational purposes, and these areas of water become an integral part of the communities as well. Yeah, it's interesting to hear your perspective on the regenerative process. I think that's something we can all stand behind. That's an excellent perspective. Also curious to know your point 10, Canada Global Indigenous Cooperation. Are you looking internationally as well for funding,
Yeah.
for training, or what's the connection globally?
About 10 years ago, the indigenous communities in Australia approached us and said, look, we need to learn from what you've been doing in Canada. And so we initially helped them set up the First Nations Clean Energy Network, which is doing gangbusters things. They've actually, some of the programs that we have with Indigenous Clean Energy, like our flagship 2020 Catalyst program, they mirrored that in Australia. But then we've taken it further. So we're working in a number of places across, particularly across the Pacific region. We've helped Indigenous communities in Colombia and Ecuador plan projects. We're actually now trying to source some of the capital to help take those projects forward. We're helping the Maori communities in New Zealand, or Aotearoa, which is the Maori name, looking at their Indigenous clean energy futures. And even islands in the South Pacific. I mean, when you look at diesel communities in Canada, which there are about 250, Well, there are diesel communities in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. There's a lot of them. So we've actually been to a few of them and we've made linkages to that. So our Canada Global Cooperation is just to say, look, I mean, Indigenous communities in different parts of the world, particularly in the Pacific regions of South America and then Australia, New Zealand, and the South Pacific, and also some connections to the Philippines and elsewhere. We've been sharing information with them. I mean, our major Indigenous clean energy gathering, which is going to go next in early October in Calgary. We'll make sure that you guys have the information about that. And we had about 30 countries arrive last time when we had it in Toronto about a year and a half ago. So that's the recognition that Indigenous peoples are around the world. So, but the lead of Indigenous partnering in projects like water power and clean energy in Canada is one that they could learn elsewhere. And so we've been sharing that.
And do we also have learnings from them, from their experiences, or are we primarily leading leading those efforts
Yeah,
from
it definitely is a two-way learning, particularly from a cultural standpoint. Because I mean, if you look, for example, in the Andean region or the Afro-Caribbean region of Colombia or the Amazonia region of Ecuador, well, those are different cultural phenomena that are there. So we learn cultural things from that side. I would say from the project side, it's more us sharing what the project examples have been here.
Mhm.
But in Australia, that's coming up pretty quick. I mean, Australian Aboriginal communities are now involved with a whole series of projects across that part of the world. So that's very positive. And yes, I mean, just like I think as you pointed out, there's benefit in sharing between developing companies, utilities, and Indigenous communities, and how we can generate more economic best practices and improve that here. I think there's a bit of sharing going on. Most of it's been us sharing out, but as this grows, we see more of an interactive process.
That's amazing. Um, One of the most rewarding things that I did in my career when I was working on infrastructure development was seeing the difference that these projects made in the communities where they came. They brought economic development opportunities, brought education, training opportunities for local tradespeople, etc. Can you talk about one of the projects that you've been involved in where you've witnessed that sort of change and sort of let people know from your perspective the positive sides to some of these projects that have come into the communities? And we can probably stop sharing the screen if you like at this
Sure.
point as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll take through the example with the Dokis Nation on the French River with the Oki Kendot Hydro project. When we were developing that project, we identified the need for, apart from the general, all the trades that we would have. And I asked Chief Denise Rastoul, I said, are there people in the community looking for jobs? And she said, yes. There's about 30 people. And I said, do they have resumes? And she said, well, no. So first of all, we hired someone to go around and develop a one-page resume for each person. And this occurred. So then we had sessions in North Bay and Sturgeon Falls and Sudbury to let the trades companies on all the subcontractors know this was coming. And we had piles of resumes printed, all 30 resumes at the back of the hall. And we said, look, we want you to employ Indigenous people from the Dokis community or the Nipissing or the French nations. They said, yes. We said, no, the resumes are back there. Well, every one of those 30 people were employed for 2 years in the project. Several got their trades qualifications. Two became stationary engineers. They actually run the operating system right now of that project. Basically, the community went from 30 people being unemployed in a community of around 200 to full employment, and that has continued. And so, to me, that kind of one of the advantages I find with hydropower projects, say in contrast to solar projects, because solar projects have a relatively small construction period. With water power projects, you're dealing with 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years worth of construction, so that gives you a long lead time for employment, which also is very important economically, but also very important in terms of qualifications. And then people get into a work environment that they're saying, okay, well now I want to be able to use that in other infrastructure developments. It could be roads, it could be a transmission, it could be other things like that. So that's the experience I really kind of revel with the Dokis Nation. And the Dokis Nation sees, apart from them being a partner in the project, generating income from the project, they now see that all the people in their community are employed and they've acquired qualifications along the way. So that's the kind of example that I think, that took planning. That took a commitment by the development partner.
Mhm.
It took commitment by the community to identify the communities. It took training along the way. We actively sought apprenticeship support from governments that was available. So in order to realize those benefits, there has to be this kind of very active, intentional, proactive approach to get the true benefits in terms of the economic returns, and particularly employment, and to some extent procurement. Trades procurement is indigenous procurement can be done with set-asides. You can also do various kind of contracting arrangements. Those tend to work more with the larger projects.
Mhm.
That's an area that I think we have to discuss more because there is a little bit of a shaky area right now where, a large project will be going ahead and they'll say, okay, well, we need to purchase a lot of aggregate, for example. And so therefore the indigenous community will then go to a company that does aggregate. They'll technically form a partnership, but the actual involvement of the indigenous community is marginal.
Wow. Mhm.
And we think there's a problem with that. We actually think this is the kind of area that we should be talking about in the sector more, about how we have really, we want to create indigenous companies and real active employment, not simply have a sort of a false, shall we say, a partnership that creates an indigenous company, but it's not really an indigenous company. To me, indigenous companies mean they're leading it, they're employed it, and they're taking the learning from a project to go to the next stage.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's a challenge, particularly in the supply chain, even from a Canadian perspective. We often don't have
Mhm.
enough Canadian involvement in our supply chains, and that's
Right.
definitely an area of focus. Our Pathways report that's coming out this week actually highlights different ways that we can work on economic development and partnerships with the communities that are involved with our members. Because there are many pathways that are available, and I think this is a really important one. It's that training for those longer term opportunities so that they can move around as well when
Yeah.
other opportunities arise. So that's excellent. Um, and do you have involvement in that in terms of the trades development aspect? Is there a partnership as well with some of the trade unions that we have in Canada that work in construction?
We have had some linkages with the trade unions, but I wouldn't say they're deep, but I do think they're part of the conversation as we try to strengthen this. Like Water Power Canada, we're involved with the skilled trades discussion that's underway, and realizing we go there, we do have certain youth programs that we train Indigenous youth after they finish college and university. We have a program called Generation Power that places them for a year in companies or projects and communities. We also have a youth program called Imagination. We think we need to strengthen that because so that it gets more into the skilled trades area. And you're right. Labor unions are a part of this conversation. Some of the labor unions historically we think have been very good in terms of being, shall I say, the word flexible to accommodate Indigenous involvement, so that people are entering into that employment chain without necessarily upfront all the qualifications they should get, but they get them through the course of doing a project.
Hmm.
Some trade unions are very hard line. They say, no, you can't be in the trade union unless you've gone through this qualification. So therefore, it's a bit more of a challenge for Indigenous people because they don't. That means they have to be employed. They have to have the money to do that and things like that. But this is the kind of thing, Lorena, that I think there's reasons for your organization, for CanREA, for Electricity Canada, for utilities, for ICE to say, okay, let's have a real working session about how we can, over a couple of days, that really delve into the detail about how we strengthen the economic nature of projects, both supply chain, trades, employment, because I think we can get better.
Well, it seems that if we're going to have 20 to 25% Indigenous participation in projects across the country, it would stand to reason that we should also be addressing how to bring more Indigenous involvement into those trades because obviously these tradespeople drive our industry. So
Absolutely.
that
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense to have those layers. Absolutely. What are some of the other more creative ways or pathways that might be available for members to think about, and not just the large crowns because they tend to have more funding and more availability for
Right.
options. But what about some of those smaller members that have Indigenous partners? What are some of the things that they're doing that you see that might be creative in this space?
I always encourage partners, be they large or small, when they work with Indigenous communities, to really try to root relationship and culture and root development in culture. I mean, another example, I mean, that's related to the Doki's project. I mean, is that, I said to Hydromega is that I needed a budget for art. I said, what are you talking about? I said, let's have a budget in the development for art. This is going to be a $64 million project. Let's put $200,000 in art and culture. They said, that's never been done before, but they agreed to do it. And so therefore, everything that included, logo design and so on. And I remember, and we actually supported artists because there's actually very little art about renewable energy. So let's create art. That could be musical art, it could be visual art, it could be paintings, it could be sculptures. And actually, one of the artists of the Dogis community at the end, and we finished the project, and he phoned me, he says, well, Chris, I finished the sculpture. I said, great, can you get it over to the project site? He goes, no, no, I need a crane. I said, what are you talking about? Well, it was a totem on top of a turtle. The turtle base weighed 2 tons.
Wow.
It's huge. And so anyway, we got a crane and we put it up. It's right beside the project. But that culture, I mean, it shows that the rooting of it was all the way through there. So I encourage smaller people, smaller companies and large companies to very much look at not the culture that people say is, okay, no, we're going to go to the powwows, we're going to support certain things. Those things are there. Yeah, some of the supports there, but look at the cultural supports that are really important. I mean, where are youth, where are elders, what supports they need, but also then root in the project, how the culture of the project the physicality of the project shows culture. To me, that is something that I think really comes alive when it does this, and it really helps the community understand that. Because I mean, any project, and particularly with a water project, they're going to say, "Look, here, it's disturbing the environment in part. That's where it does." But let's also make sure that it fits and reflects things in the environment. Let's make sure that its footprint is as low as possible, and preferably even restorative. But those are the kinds of things that really make a really big difference. And it's not the conventional nature of project development. I mean, it's not what a typical project development that a manager will do or an engineering team will do. But I really encourage them to look at where the community's interests are and respond to those interests.
I think that's an excellent point. And that is, I think, a very credible way of building trust between the community and the project. And I think when you look at any complex project, it's always about the people at the end of the day. If you've got delays, if
Yeah,
you've got conflict on the site, it all comes down to the people that are trying to build and realize this vision of this project. And when you extend the sensitivity to the culture and the art and people that are involved can see the work of their community being reflected in that space, I think it absolutely makes a huge difference to the environment and makes it much easier
definitely.
to get these projects completed. That's an excellent point. So if you were looking 20 years into the future, we've talked about there's an electricity strategy that was just released by the federal government there that talks about doubling power production between now and 2050. If your vision into the future were to happen, how would you see that? Eh, what would make you feel as though the bases that we're building today were successful in their intent?
That's a good question. I'd highlight three things. First of all, I mean, as we all appreciate, I mean, the best energy is energy you may not need. So you're making a commitment to energy efficiency. I mean, next week in Montreal is a major event with the International Energy Agency, which I'll be at, which is their global conference in energy efficiency. That's one area that we are spending more time with. One of our programs is called Bringing It Home, which is an accelerator program which trains Indigenous communities to make their housing more efficient. There hasn't been a lot of support there that we're pushing for that side, but we're training people to do that. So I said, one is that let's make sure we are designing our demand footprint in the right way, so we're doing the right thing. Which will, if we do that, we make the rest of the economics work better. Secondly, what I would say is that there's more Indigenous entrepreneurship on the part of Indigenous supply companies, Indigenous service companies. I mean, there's a company called Nipissing Power that's owned by Nipissing First Nation up in that part of the world. They have a company that's providing materials and supplies to the clean energy sector, both transmission and generation. We'd like to see more of that. So I think it's where it's not simply that Indigenous communities are only going to be co-owners of projects, but they're actually moving into the entrepreneurial section and also with partner with private sector. I have no problem with private sector partnerships on civil contracting or materials or equipment or hauling or things like that. Those are good. Let's make sure they're true partnerships so
Mhm.
that you actually have Indigenous leadership in there, along with private sector leadership, along with private capital, where all are benefiting. And I think the third thing I would note, Lorena, is that these projects that you'll see from the national survey is that it's kicking off a lot of money now. It's kicking off around $400 million dollars a year that's being generated by all these projects. That's a lot of money. So the question is, how does it get used well?
Mhm.
I've always encouraged sort of like a balanced approach where, some of it's used for the needs today, some of it's used for economic development, and some of it's used for long-term legacy impacts, which could be for future generations, it could be for infrastructure. And so we think that now Indigenous communities need to be much more, and some of the communities are doing a really good job about this. They're being very intentional about how they're using the capital. Some are just, addressing the needs, and all of a sudden, it's sort of like the Alberta, wealth fund where they spend all the money they earned on oil and gas and they never saved any of it. Well, let's
Yeah.
let's make sure we use the capital coming in a very intentional way to address some of the social and human needs of today, but also then investing in economic development and also long-term infrastructure. So those would be the three things I would note. One is that more focus on energy efficiency. So we're doing the right thing. So we're getting the right footprint because we do that. The economics of the whole system works better. Secondly, is making sure we have more Indigenous entrepreneurial ownership and leadership. And thirdly, the use of capital in a really intentional way to have a long-term spin factor. So it's a virtuous circle that can go for decades.
And how do you extend those recommendations to the communities?
Well, a lot of it's done through our programs. In the training we do, like if you look at our 2020 Catalyst program, which is now in its 10th year, it's a very intensive program. We take about 20, 25 people into it a year. It goes over a 6 to 8 month period. There are three one-week sessions that they are in person. During that session, there are about half a dozen webinars. They all have mentors. They have community mentors. They have technical mentors. And so we train them how to do those things in the projects they're going to take forward. So how do you make sure you create, procurement for Indigenous companies? How do you structure your equity ownership and there's another report we have called it's called With Us. It's the Clean Energy Equity Guide, and we'll make sure you have the link to that as well.
Oh,
So how do you
great.
make sure your ownership and your ownership of a clean energy project with partners is owned by a corporate entity like a corporate trust and others, and you structure it so that the use of trust earnings are allocated along with the trust agreement that specifies the use. So those are the kind of things we train in our capacity. So our capacity training is very intentional. Like it's intensive. These are not 2 day workshops. These are game changing. We kind of we describe the Catalyst program as being virtually like a clean energy MBA. If you go into it and have the 200 people or so that have gone through the program in the last 20 years or 10 years rather, they'll say to them, almost all of them will say it changed their lives. So that's where our core value added is making sure Indigenous communities have the depth of learning and the depth of support to be able to really change the way they work with partners and the way they take projects forward.
That's amazing. And are these online, these programs?
No, no, most of them are in person. That's it's we do have certain online tools and we certain virtual tools that complement that. We do have a new curriculum being developed right now with the University of Saskatchewan for our youth programs. But at the end of the day, the tactile experiential learning is key. Our first week of our Catalyst program this year was down at Six Nations. So obviously we were spending time in the wind projects and the solar projects that Six Nations Development Corp owns. Matt Jameson takes them through the financing structures and how he did the partnerships. So the hands-on tactile stuff is really kind of important. And we have involvements from different companies, different utilities. We have a very high standard in terms of who we invite to participate as mentors. But I've got Corey coming from Sasquatch up to Whitehorse to the Catalyst program in a few weeks' time because he's going to be sharing about how grid management's working and how they can work as a utility with Indigenous partners and projects. So these are very in-depth in-depth learnings.
Amazing. And then also there's the opportunity if people are able to travel to our conference, our annual conference in the fall, if they want to learn
Yes.
specifics about hydro. I would invite them to come October 28th to 30th as well. That's another opportunity to deepen that learning
Yes,
about how our
definitely.
sector works, of course,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, I don't see any questions in the chat, so I think we're probably close to ready to leave it there. Chris, this was a great conversation. Again, I invite everybody to look at our Pathways report that's coming out this week. It will be available in both English and French. And Ian, I think or Chris, we usually see each other at our conference and at the Canria conferences and whatnot. So we will be looking for you as well to join us this fall. And yeah, thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me. Have a
Okay,
great day.
thank you. Bye bye.
Bye now.